مرحبا بكم جميعا
Hello,
في هذا اللقاء الذي
everyone.
تنظمه شركة
Welcome
أريج
to you in
ضمن
this webinar organized
النسخة
by
السابعة.
Arij,
موضوعنا
Open
واحد
Source
يتناول واحد
Diploma.
من أهم
Today's
الأدوات التي
topic
غيرت مسار تأكد
addresses one of the
الصحافة
main
بشكل
tools
عام
that
وصحافة البيانات والصحافة الاستقصائية بشكل
that
خاص.
tackles the
اليوم الأمر
open
الاجتماعي وهي
investigation
صحافة المصادر المفتوحة
collaboration,
ومعرفة
which
أوسنت
is open
وكيف يمكن
OSINT,
توظيفها
open source
بطريقة
intelligence, and how
عملية.
it could be
ضيفنا
employed
في
in
هذا
cross-border
الويبينار هو توم
investigations. Our colleague
باحث في جامعة
today is
كولستر
Tom
بريطانيا
Main. He's a
وسابق
research
معهد
fellow
البحث
at the
السنتر
Department of International
شارتر هاوس.
Relations of the
يكون
University
لديه
of
خبرة
Exeter.
طويلة في التحقيقات
Tom
في جرائم
has
الاتصالات وغسل
extensive
الأموال وسرقة الهوية. وعمل
expertise in money
سابقا مع
laundering
منظمة
and
الطب
so on.
الممتاز
His went
التي
with
ساهم معها في إنشاء
kleptocratic
مجموعة من
financial flows.
التحقيقات
He's
العالمية البارزة
worked
في
with
المجال.
significant
توم
open source
سيعطينا اليوم
investigations.
تجربة
Source will take
عدة
us today
تحقيقات
in a tour
مهمة
through different
وتجارب شخصية
investigations, through different
وكواليس هذه التحقيقات
experiences and
الخاصة بأحداث
backgrounds and
قضية الغاز
challenges,
الأوكراني، قضايا
like the Ukrainian
أذربيجان،
gas to
باكستان،
Azerbaijan,
كازاخستان.
Kyrgyzstan, and
ليوضح هذا
Kazakhstan. He
المحور
will tell
كيف
us more
يمكن
about
كصحفيين
step by
عرب
step how can we as
باستخدام المصادر
investigators
المفتوحة
use open source
المتاحة للجميع
and available
لنشر
sources to
ونقل
all
شبكات
to
ملكية
open up, to
معقدة
follow
تمتد
on
عبر الدول
complicated
أو ربما
networks
عبر
that are
القارات.
cross borders
خلال الويبنار الآن عندنا
through
أسئلة.
this webinar.
حاب يسأل
In this
توم
webinar, you
في
can please
أسئلة
pose your questions
في
in the Q&A
أسفل
feature
الشاشة.
at the
الأسئلة
bottom of
أحسن
the
من
screen,
استقبالها
and just to
والتعليق
make use
عليها
of the
أفضل.
questions and try to
بعد كل
answer all these
محور
questions.
في
After
سيكشن
each section
بنجاوب
of this
على أسئلة.
webinar, we will
تفضل
answer a
تحط
batch of
الأسئلة من خلال
questions. So
الشات.
please
تحطوا الأسئلة من خلال الشات.
write your questions
بنحاول
in the Q&A and not
نستفيد
the
من
chat
توم في
to
هذا
make
الويبينار.
use of
نحاول
Tom's expertise and
نوجد أفكار
get new
ومفاجآت من
ideas
خلال هذا
and
تجربة
outcomes
توم.
through
نعرض عليه على إفادة
this
وأستفادة
webinar
الجميع
and
ويمكن
to
عمل
work on
تفاعل مع
reports
رائد
and
الأخرى. توم.
investigations that can be done. Welcome to you, Tom.
Many thanks, Mohammed, and many thanks for organizing this session. I hope you will all find it interesting. It's very hot here today in London. It's as hot in London as it is in Jordan, but probably know we British, we can't cope with the heat. We don't have air conditioning. It's only 30 degrees, so if it gets any hotter, I'm not sure what we're going to be able to do. But yes, I'm going to take you through my work. I've been working as a researcher, an investigator, and writer for the last 20 years, primarily for the organization Global Witness. And I will take you through some of the reports I did for Global Witness. I know my strengths. I really am not a data guy. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a data scientist. What I think I do well is I think I'm a good writer. Can create a narrative that people can follow and understand. I can show where the issues are with money laundering and how it pertains to how it affects the United Kingdom. And I think I'm a good investigator as well, but I know my limits and where I need to consult with others in order to find information, and we can talk a little bit about that as we go through. I'm going to share my presentation. Let's have a look here. Okay. You can see that?
Okay, yeah, we can see it.
Fantastic, thank you. So primarily we're going to be speaking about open source intelligence today, and this idea of when we need to get help from people in other countries. And to start off, I thought I would refer to this article from about 17 years ago. This is about spy agencies, the CIA, talking about how they're starting to turn to open source information. What I found was interesting was the quote there. It says that historically, usually, the way that the bosses of these spy agencies work is that despite there being plenty of information in the public domain about, I think they were talking about China in this particular article, if there wasn't some classified information in the report, if there wasn't something from a source, a high-level source speaking secretly, the boss of this particular spy agency wouldn't believe it was accurate. So this boss was placing human intelligence, secret source intelligence, over open source intelligence. This article was suggesting that this is changing, and certainly from my perspective, as a journalist or investigator, I feel that there's a lot more you can do with open source information that is perhaps even more useful than human intelligence. There's more open source information than ever before. We all know about the document leaks, the famous ones from the last 15 years. I think it's just been 10 years since the Panama Papers. And all this information is now available to us. If you don't know about the Aleph database is run by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. I think anybody can sign up, put their email in, and get a login for the Aleph database. I think there are various levels of access, but anybody can get the most basic access. And Aleph basically puts all these document leaks into one place, and it's a great starting point for if you want to do an investigation. And what I was saying there about how I think open source information is really the way to go, certainly from somebody like me. There's a story here. We don't need to get into the details. It's quite complex, and it's not an investigation I was involved in. But Bellingcat, an organization that researches Russian corruption, Russian organized crime. If you remember the poisoning in the United Kingdom of Sergei Skripal, the former Russian officer, intelligence officer who was living in exile in the UK. He was poisoned in Salisbury, not too far from London. And using basically open source intelligence, Bellingcat identified who these two Russian officers were by using a variety of databases. Okay, you could argue that not all of these databases the general public would have access to, such as flight records and things like that. But through open source information, they managed to find out what they think is the two people who commonly believed to be the two people who poisoned Sergei Skripal, perhaps even quicker than the UK or authorities did. So that's the power we have at our hands here. A very powerful tool. But of course, there are some challenges, some dangers. And certainly when it comes to challenges, I always say is, how do we as researchers not only tell the story, but get people interested in the story? And to do that, I'm going to talk you through some of my Global Witness reports. Here are some of the reports we're going to be talking about. And interestingly, most of these reports were written and investigated before this glut of information from the document leaks, before the Panama Papers, before the Pandora Papers. So I will tell you how we managed to do them. And what I would always start off with is just talking about, well, what is the story here? This particular story called "It's a Gas," which is a phrase in English that means that something's funny. So the idea was a little bit of a joke that the people who were behind these companies making so much money were laughing all the way to the bank. And it concerned these mysterious middleman companies that in the early 2000s were involved in supplying gas to the Ukraine. And this was back at a time when Ukraine was controlled by presidents that were much closer to the Kremlin and to President Putin. Now, the main question about these companies was, why did they need to exist? All of the infrastructure, all of the pipelines from Central Asia through Russia to Ukraine were owned by Gazprom, the Russian state company. So there was really no need for these companies to exist. So this really brings up the question of why, if the Russian state, of all things, was giving up money because it was paying these companies to do this, it was losing revenue because these companies were earning money by delivering to gas to Ukraine. Why were these companies existed? And the hypothesis was this was basically corruption. This was a way to get money away from the Russian state, but into private hands. And that money could be used to possibly bribe people, to pay off politicians. Now, could we say that? Could we say that it was absolutely 100% corruption? No, because we couldn't see payments going to politicians. But we can certainly present the business case for why these companies would be such a strange thing to have in existence. If you were the Russian state and you controlled all the pipelines, why would you be allowing a private company to earn all this money? And on top of that, no one knew who owned these companies. So you had a question about energy security. And part of the challenge as a non-governmental organization, Global Witness, an anti-corruption organization in London, was how do you make that relevant to the UK audience? It's so interesting in the UK, we have Belgium and the Netherlands 50 kilometers away over the English Channel. But we never read stories in England about Belgium or the Netherlands. And this is a story about Central Asia and Russia and Ukraine. So very difficult to get people to pay attention to it. How do we get people to pay attention to it? We have to link it to something that is relevant to the UK audience. So we talk about energy security. It's very dangerous seeing that this gas, which was transported to Ukraine, was then transported to Europe and maybe some to the UK too. We need to know who controls our energy supplies. It's very dangerous to have a company where the owners could be anybody controlling this key resource. We all remember in Europe when Russia turned off the gas around about this time, countries such as Bulgaria had to go without gas for a few days in midwinter. So this was absolutely key story. So we took something that maybe seems a little bit obscure, gas companies, Turkmenistan, Russia, and make it relevant to the UK audience. And because Global Witness was a campaigning organization, we would talk about what we could do to maybe improve the situation, talking about transparency of company ownership and the fact that even though we wouldn't have the ability to remove these companies because it was decided by Russia, of course, we don't think that these companies should exist. So that's the background to this report. This was the first report that I worked on at Global Witness 20 years ago. And it posed a challenge to investigate these companies. And first thing we did was to look at this company. The first company was called Ural Transgas. You can see there it earned $220 million. So we're talking absolutely massive amounts of money. None of this money, because it was a private company, was going to the Russian state. And on top of all of that, the person whose name was on the piece of paper as the shareholder of this company was this lady on the left, who it turned out was an actress who said she got involved to pay her phone bill. Now, clearly, she was not going to be the actual owner of this billion-dollar company. She was what we call a proxy owner. And there is actually a good example of cross-border collaboration. This lady was in Romania. We were in the UK. We had a colleague of ours, Paul Radu, who had just founded the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Unit. And he went to this lady's house and spoke to her, and it was clear from speaking to her that she was not the owner of the company. Then what happened? Well, then a few months later, in 2004, Ural Transgas, the company, this middleman company, acquired 3 new shareholders, and they're listed there. One in Seychelles, Karma Holdings, and then 2 in Europe. And I think that is going to be a recurring theme. how much of this corruption has ties to Europe. So it's not just something happening over there, over in Russia, over in Central Asia, but something that is embedded in our own systems here in Europe. And these two companies, one was called JKX Gas, which in itself was interesting because there was already a legitimate company in the UK called JKX Oil and Gas. We asked them if there was any link, and they said no. So you have a story there. Are they trying to pass themselves off as a legitimate company? And we often find this in corruption schemes where a company will name itself similar to a legitimate company in order to try and bolster its reputation, in order to pretend that it is perhaps got some proper investment behind it. And this third company, DEG Handels in Austria. So what did we do then? We have three company names. We then map out the ownership structure of these three companies. We go to Seychelles, not in person, but the company registry, Austria and Netherlands, in order to find out who owns these companies. And even though we still find that the real owner, the beneficial owner, as we call it, is nowhere on the paper, what we found was very interesting, that even though it looked like this company had, after it got rid of the Romanian actress, it looked like they had got three investors. In fact, if you trace that company ownership back, it goes back to just one law firm in Cyprus. And so they were attempting to look like it had three owners, when really it was likely one owner or one group of owners. And we had assistance from journalists and partners in countries for where the companies were registered. I remember at Global Witness at one point, we had a database of a spreadsheet of different countries and their company registers, and how you could access those registers, what it cost, what information you could get there. This spreadsheet was actually quite hard to maintain because company registers are always changing, the price is often changing, the system is often changing, but I still maintain people and friends and colleagues in other countries that I can go to. And if I need a company from, say, a company document from, say, Cyprus, I can say to my friend, can you help me get this document? So sometimes, obviously, language difficulties as well. So it was a collaborative effort in order to produce this chart. So we were getting a little bit further with the truth of this company. Then, out of nowhere, Transgas, this strange company delivering gas to Ukraine, was replaced by another company. This is now July 2004, registered in Zug in Switzerland, so again in Europe. And this company was called Ros-Ukr-Energo, RUE. Now, only 4 days after it had been registered, it signed this multi-million-dollar contract with President Putin and Kuchma of Ukraine. Again, that would raise a question, certainly from a business point of view. Why is this new company, only been in existence for 4 days, being granted this lucrative contract? Surely you would want an existing company with lots of experience in this kind of gas delivery business to be in charge of this. But no, this very new company was being given the contract. Now, the ownership was a little bit different here. Finally, Gazprom had 50% of the company, but 50% still remained unknown. And again, the question was, well, why does Gazprom have to give up 50%? What services is this company providing that Gazprom can't itself do? And again, we investigated this company, its ownership structure. We made a little chart. This chart looks a little bit old because it's from 2006. This isn't necessarily on company ownership, but this is showing the links between Ros-Ukr-Energo at the top and Transgas at the bottom. The same people, the same directors, the same company registrars who were involved in one company were involved in this second company. So it looked very much like that. Even though the company had changed, the people behind the company had not changed. And again, we're talking about massive revenues here, $755 million in 2005, 50% of which was not going to the Russian state. So clearly a corruption risk that Russia would give up these revenues. And because of the Global Witness report and other people investigating this, Bill Browder of Hermitage Capital, who's famously become one of President Putin's fiercest critics, his company Hermitage was also investigating this. It was finally revealed by Russian state media, who were feeling the pressure of all these unanswered questions about the company, that this Ukrainian oligarch, Dmitry Firtash, was the actual owner of Rosukhonergo, and it was revealed that he had also been the owner of Ural Transgas before it. So then the question becomes, well, who is this Dmitry Firtash? Where has he come from? Is he a legitimate businessman? Does he have any ties to politicians? That was the next task, and there were various allegations had been mentioned on the internet, various leaked information, conversations from the US ambassador to Ukraine that alleged that Mr. Firtash had ties to organized crime. So that was another thing that we could investigate. And I think before we get on to the information in this slide, it's worth talking about what happened with those accusations of links to organized crime that Firtash denied. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about human intelligence versus open source intelligence. Global Witness actually employed somebody from the intelligence community, formerly of the intelligence community, to go to Ukraine, interview lots of people, and to come back with a report on the middleman companies, Rosukhonergo, and their alleged ties to organized crime. But we couldn't use it because it was all unnamed sources, and because of the libel concerns in the United Kingdom that we'll get onto later, we felt that it just wasn't strong enough. So that was an example of the human intelligence. May have been good, it may not have been good, feeling that we couldn't use it because we didn't have a document. Ultimately, what happened was a journalist from the Financial Times discovered that a known organized criminal, someone who had a record for, had been found guilty of criminal activity, had registered his vehicle at an office used by Dmitry Firtash, one of Firtash's company. So that's provide a real factual link between Firtash and organized crime. Now, Firtash said that he had no idea why this person had registered their car there, but it shows you how documentary evidence can allow you to ask questions and to put out there allegations that perhaps other organizations can take on. Always interesting to see. That was 20 years ago. What happened with Dmitry Firtash and these middleman companies that were earning so much money in Ukraine? Rosukhonergo held the contract for several more years to 2009. But despite the fact that the middleman scheme was stopped, Firtash himself continued to wield great power in Ukraine from a business sense. He controlled as much of 70% of Ukrainian gas delivery until 2022. He moved to Austria. We remember one of the Ural Transgas shareholders being registered in Austria. And he also put out links to the United Kingdom. On the right is his house, and underneath that, an old metro station, the Tube, as we call it, in London, that he purchased incredibly from the Ministry of Defence, because it was an old metro station. The UK state owned it, and despite all these allegations being out there against Mr. Firtash, the UK government thought it was okay for Firtash to purchase this metro station, disused metro station. I think his idea was, because it was next to his house, to turn it into some kind of mega mansion. But he never did that because he was then wanted in the United States on accusations of being involved in a bribery scheme. In the end, that bribery scheme, the extradition attempt failed, so he remained in Austria. And finally, in 2024, Dmitro Firtash was sanctioned by the UK government in my mind, 15 years too late. By 2024, he was no longer involved in business in Ukraine. He was no longer involved in the middleman companies. This was something that should have been looked at the time when this figure was involved in this very questionable business between the Ukraine and Russia. I think I'll just do one more report, and then we'll see if there are any particular questions on these two reports. I think I'll deal with this report just because it is quite similar how this framework of an investigation, these tactics that we had created for the first report, It's a Gas, we could then use in other countries. This was another report we did on Azerbaijan Anonymous. And there we saw similar scheme, perhaps not middleman companies. They weren't involved in gas delivery, but they were involved with joint ventures, contracts with SOCAR, the Azerbaijani state gas company. Again, Global Witness, we're based in the UK. We're trying to make it relevant to a UK audience. We're talking about Azerbaijan as an important country for our gas. We were also, as Global Witness, involved in something called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which was supposed to create more transparency in the oil and gas industry. And yet SOCAR, the state company of Azerbaijan, was doing all these deals with this person whose name we revealed to be Anar Aliyev, who we didn't know who he was and why he was involved, because again, it seemed like SOCAR were giving up revenues that they should be earning to this one man. And through this report, we discovered that this Anar Aliyev had as many as almost 50 deals with SOCAR through various joint ventures, contracts, and so on. And again, all of this was open source information. We used SOCAR's annual reports. As a state company, they were producing annual reports. And whenever it said that SOCAR struck a deal with this company, SOCAR has formed a joint venture with company Y. We investigated that company, went to company registers, worked out who owns these companies, and we found that in 48 different occasions, it was this guy, Anar Aliyev, who nobody at that time knew who he was. Also interesting, the president of Azerbaijan, also called Aliyev. Now, of course, it's a very common name in Azerbaijan, but that gave us something also to investigate. In the end, we didn't find any familial links between Anar Aliyev and President Aliyev, but we did note that Anar Aliyev was from Nakhchivan, and a lot of the political elite of Azerbaijan come from Nakhchivan. Again, we have many links to Europe, to Switzerland, SOCAR trading. SOCAR trading kind of was actually a little bit like Ros Uka Energo from the first case study. It was an oil trading company registered in Switzerland. And again, it had 50% ownership by SOCAR, 50% ownership by two men, one of which was Anar Aliyev. Again, why would SOCAR be giving up these revenues? Again, we can't say 100% it's corruption because we can't see any onward money trails between Aliyev and Azeri politicians. But we can point to no evidence of proper bidding processes, no public tenders. How is this man being selected? We can just raise questions over the transparency of the arrangements. Fast forward, this report was in 2013. We fast forward 12 years. What's changed? Well, Anar Aliyev, or Alizadeh, as he now refers to himself, he was outed as a key figure in Azeri business. The photo pictured there was from his own publicity materials, trying to present himself as a legitimate businessman. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan has unfortunately slid further down into corrupt kleptocracy, lots of crackdowns on freedom of speech, crackdown on journalism, crackdown on any political processes that exist there, leading to Azerbaijan leaving the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative in 2017, not necessarily because of this report, but just because they weren't transparent in fulfilling their requirements of EITI. But as we know, after Russia invades Ukraine in 2022, the EU looks for other sources of energy supply. Azerbaijan has lots of gas. EU now has to rely on Azerbaijan to get some of its gas. And because of its partnership with the EU, not much is being done about the corruption that we often see in Azerbaijan, and the country gets rewarded with hosting COP29 in 2024. So that's the second case study. Perhaps if there are any questions on those two reports, we can take them now. Allow me to get a glass of water.
Actually, there is a group of questions. Let me start with the first topic you mentioned regarding the first story. It is gas. You used the company records to track how the companies, there were three different companies, Seychelles, the Netherlands, and Austria. These were like facades for one owner. What was the red flag in the companies that gave away that several entities might be owned by one person? This is the first question, and there are three more or four more questions.
Sure. Good question. If we go back to this chart, you can see the three companies there. So on the left, Netherlands, and then in the middle, Seychelles, and on the right, Austria. And getting the company records at that time, it would say that the shareholder. And so for JKX Gas on the left, the shareholder was BH Oil and Gas. It had two shareholders. It also had JKX Oil and Gas PLC, although that said it was a nominal shareholder, so didn't really hold any shares. But then that next company, BH Oil and Gas, registered in Denmark, we would then get the record from Denmark. And that led to another document that said that the company above that, Miro Trading Limited, registered in Cyprus, was the next level up. So we kept going further and further back until we couldn't go back any longer. And we found that one company, JKX Gas, led to BH Oil and Gas, which led to Miro Trading, which led to Dema Secretarial, and then top right-hand corner, Dema Trustees. And when we did that for the other two companies, it all led back to this one company, Dema Trustees. So it's not a guarantee that one person owns the company, but it seems like it's a scheme that has been set up by this one Cypriot law firm. And so it's not actually three separate owners, maybe three investors thinking, oh, this is going to be a good opportunity. It wasn't that. It seemed like because one law firm was behind it, it seemed like that one group of people would be behind it. And in the end, we were proved right. So we couldn't say for sure it was one group of people, but we could say that the fact that it all led back to the one place, this was good evidence to show that it was.
Thanks, Tom. There is another question related to the first story. It is gas. How did you verify in your investigation that Louise, the actress, was only a proxy? Because this is repeated. People with limited income are used as proxy shareholders for the beneficial owners. Is this the case?
Yes. Originally, before those three companies became the owners of Ural Transgas, the shareholder on the name of Ural Transgas was Louise Lukács. And at that point, she could have been anybody. She could have been a billionaire. But what Paul Radu did in what Paul Radu did in Romania was find her address, go and interview her, and say, well, what do you know about this company? And I only gave a little bit of the interview there where she said, she got involved to pay her phone bill. But clearly she said some other things like she wasn't the real owner. She was doing it on behalf of a friend, as a favor to a friend. She doesn't know who the real owner is, and so on. So often the only way you can get that information that someone's a proxy is by interviewing them. And of course, there's another problem sometimes. the person may actually say that they are a proxy. Now, so that then they're not a proxy, that they are the owner. Obviously, with the case with that lady, you could tell from where she was living that she wasn't really going to be the owner of a billion-dollar company. But in more sophisticated schemes, we have quite sophisticated people saying that they're proxies, and we're going to meet somebody later who says that they are, and then it's much harder to show that they are actual proxies.
The same thing happened with Panama and Pandora papers. There were many proxies, and many of them did not know that their names were registered in thousands of companies. The third question is related to the story of Azerbaijan. You said that the SOCAR was matched with the company register. How did you know that Alizada and Aliyev were the same person or different persons? And is this, I mean, common in Asia and the Arab world?
The starting point for this for this investigation was SOCAR's annual reports, and so whenever there was a name of a company, we then investigated that company. And when we did that, the same thing as we did with the oil transgas, Anar Aliyev's name was at the top of it. We wrote to him many times to get his comments about his involvement, and he didn't reply until the report came out. When he saw the report, then he was quite keen to put his comments on record. He himself actually said that he was Anar Alizadeh. He kind of renamed himself, I think, because of the closeness of the name to the president's name, the president of Azerbaijan. He himself said, "I am Anar Aliyev, and I'm now calling myself Anar Alizadeh." I think is it common to have? I think the question was, is it common to have these kind of proxies? I think certainly across the former Soviet Union, which is the area I'm an expert in, it's incredibly common. It is the system of kleptocracy. It's so easy to have someone standing in for a politician, because obviously you can't have the politician there, so they have a network of people. And in Kazakhstan, which we'll get onto later, the networks are so widespread, and the proxies have their own money to a certain extent. They're also very, unlike Louise Lukács, who we saw at the beginning, they have their own businesses, their own properties, and it becomes very harder to try and disentangle the web that has been created underneath the politicians.
Thank you, Tom. Two more questions related to the sources. The first question, you mentioned around 50 transactions with SOCAR without international bidding. Have you depended on the companies, or did you seek sources in the same sector to make sure that there were no competitive bids?
This was a question we asked SOCAR. We as journalists, investigators, for not only for libel reasons, but just for good investigative reasons, you write to the source and get their answers. And we asked SOCAR, please provide any information of bidding processes, of auctions, of tenders. And they didn't reply to that question. I think they replied with a rather generic answer. So sometimes it's the way you phrase something. So I think if you look at the report, we probably didn't say there were no tenders. We would say something like, we have found no evidence of tenders. And in one or two examples, I think Azeri MPs, some of the ones who are slightly more independent, had raised questions that particular deals, there had not been a bidding process. So we couldn't say it for sure for all 48 deals, but having done our research, we couldn't find any evidence that there was a competitive bidding process. And when we asked SOCAR, they also didn't say that there was. So you can make up your own mind from that.
Thank you, Tom. One question from Nabil Snono, our colleague. Can we have a list of OSINTs for it is gas, and the other one for Azerbaijan? Can we have a list of OSINT sources?
I mean, absolutely. And certainly one thing I would say, though, is that here the records aren't that sophisticated in terms of there was no document leak from Panama or wherever. It was literally just going to SOCAR and getting the annual report, which was, I think, in this year, I think we looked from 2006 to 2012. We looked at all the annual reports, and then, you know, maybe those reports are still available online. I'm not sure. And then after that, you then go and just do what I've explained with the companies and go to the company registries and find out the ownership detail. Now, obviously, what will have happened now is that a lot of these deals will not exist anymore. They would have been stopped either because of the report or just because this is 12 years later now. So if you try and recreate it and find the owners of these particular companies, they may well have changed. And this is actually one challenge sometimes we face as investigators, is trying to get historic documents from companies, because you can get the current situation. Depending on the country, you can only sometimes get the current information. Sometimes you can pay a little bit more and get information from some years ago. So Global Witness, I think, would hold a file which would contain all of this information in order to prove, everything that they're saying. I don't think I've got access to it anymore because I'm no longer at Global Witness. But theoretically, you could recreate what was done back then and just find all of those companies that had links to Anar Alizadeh. I mean, the first resource would obviously be that report, which is available online. You can see there's every Global Witness report has about 200, 300 footnotes. Some of those links will still be active. It'd be interesting to see how many of them still are, because as we know, the internet, it changes and a lot of the links will no longer be active. But that would be your starting point for sure if you wanted to see the working, see the research that went into this report.
Thank you, Tom. We can proceed. And Tom, this is a note from the interpreter. If you can slow down a bit and bring the microphone a bit closer to your mouth. Thank you.
Sure. How is this? I think maybe spoke.
This is good.
I spoke a little bit quicker in the answers. I think I get a bit excited when the questions are so good. Okay, so let's move on to. I've got two more reports I want to go through. This one focuses on the Kyrgyz Republic, a small nation in Central Asia. History of Kyrgyz Republic, the modern history, often thought of as one of the more democratic countries in Central Asia, but very politically volatile. And in 2005, there was a popular uprising to replace one president. And then in 2010, there was a second uprising to replace Kurmanbek Bakiev. Now, one of the reasons for so much popular unrest in the Kyrgyz Republic was because Bakiev had promised to reform the country, but unfortunately, he just made it more corrupt. And after he was removed from power in 2010, it was alleged by the new authorities who came into power in 2010 that the country's largest bank, Asia Universal Bank, was a money laundering vehicle. Now, as Global Witness, we're speaking with the new authorities of the Kyrgyz Republic. We can't necessarily take their word as fact. They're obviously opponents of the Bakiev regime. how do we know what they're saying is the truth? Again, as I've said in previous reports, how do we make this an important story for the UK? Well, we talk about the global financial system and how this bank, even though it was in the Kyrgyz Republic, had many correspondent accounts with various banks in the United States and in the UK. So money can easily be transferred using corresponding banking from one bank to another. And our campaigning aim in this report was to show how easy it was to register companies. We call them shell companies. And when we talk about shell companies, we don't mean companies who are actually doing some proper business like Nike or Google. We're talking about the companies that solely exist on paper and solely exist in order to move money, sometimes illegal money, around the world. And one of the things that we used to develop this campaigning aim was this sentence you see in the third bullet point there, that you need more identification, more ID to get a library card in the United Kingdom than to open a company. And surely when you can use a company to commit financial crime, that is not a good situation. And so our aim as Global Witness was to get transparency around company ownership, end the system of having proxies on a piece of paper, have the actual owner on paper, and to speak out against this ridiculous system where anybody can register a company for, I think it was £12 in the United Kingdom, which is what, $20 US, and register a company and not have at this time the real owner of the company on paper. So we did a similar thing to what we were doing with the other two reports, but on a much wider scale. From the Kyrgyz Republic, we had a list of companies that had bank accounts at this Asia Universal Bank, which was now accused of being a money laundering vehicle by the new authorities. And we don't necessarily need to see the detail, but all of the companies all of the things you see at the top and bottom are individual companies that had accounts at Asia Universal Bank. And what you would expect if the bank was legitimate, would that be all these companies would be separate, and some of them you'd be able to Google and find out that they were doing legitimate business, like an oil company or a trucking company or whatever. But when you Googled all these companies, you had no information on them. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not legitimate, but that's evidence towards a pattern. But what was most interesting was how all of these companies had links to one another by these company service providers. These company service providers who are just a man in a room signing papers and forming companies on behalf of other people, acting as a proxy. And we could show that these companies were linked by just 4 company service providers. There was one in Russia, and there was one in Panama. But importantly for us in the UK, a lot of these companies were registered in the United Kingdom, not in our famous islands, not in the Isle of Man or Jersey or the British Virgin Islands, but registered in the United Kingdom, in the mainland of the United Kingdom. And this is a problem. This is an example of the United Kingdom being used for potentially, we haven't proved it yet, financial crime. But the evidence increased when we were doing some researches on people who were the shareholders of these companies. One man was a Russian. We did some Google searches on him, and we found that his name had been used in a prior corruption case in Russia. And furthermore, he was actually dead, and someone had fraudulently used his name to register a company in Russia. After that, his name had been used for a company in the Kyrgyz Republic. And not only that, $700 million passed through this company, and we had a a bank record which showed that money flowing through this company. So that allegation that we had at the beginning of the investigation that this company, this bank was a money laundering vehicle, is now starting to get more evidence that the fact that there's all these companies being registered, and they seem to be registered by these same shadowy company service providers. And not only that, they're using the passports of people who are no longer alive. So this was interesting and certainly evidence of corruption. But where was the link to the Bakiev family, the family of the president who'd just been deposed? The new authorities were saying that the Bakiev family had used this bank to launder money, to steal money from the Kyrgyz Republic before they were removed from power. Where is the evidence? We focused on these 4 companies, all of which were registered in Belize, and all of which had the same registered office in Belize and the same registration agent, all at one map street. Maxim Bakiev was the son of the president, and he was often regarded by the new authorities as the kingpin of Kyrgyz corruption. They alleged that he was involved in taking over businesses, in controlling the Kyrgyz economy when his dad was in power, and they also accused him of stealing state funds. But he said that he had nothing to do with this bank. He had no accounts at the bank. So how do we show that that is or isn't true? What happened to Maxim Bakiev after 2010? He flies, of course, to the United Kingdom, where he is granted asylum. At the same time, the American authorities want to question him on an allegation of insider trading. And so there is an extradition hearing at the High Court in London. Courts, very useful places for information. I went there and got the documents that showed that Bakiev had an address in the UK, but it was only a partial address. You see it at the top there, Spring House, Kingswood, KT20. Now, postcodes in the UK have 3 more letters or numbers after that, KT20 plus three letters, 3 or 4. So that won't give you the exact address. But what can we do in the UK? We have many databases that can help us with property ownership in the UK. But there are some challenges. So you can't, for example, put in someone's name and see if they own a property in the UK for privacy and data protection reasons. So if I was looking for Tom Main, I put his, you can't find my address or anybody's address. But what you can do in the United Kingdom is if someone owns a property through an offshore company, the UK government maintains a list publicly available, so it's open source information on those companies and the property they own. So we put all those companies that had the bank accounts at Asia Universal Bank into this database, which gives the addresses of companies that own properties in the UK. Unfortunately, we got 0 hits. We didn't have any link to this Spring House, Maxim Bakiev's house. Since that time, I think this report was published in 2012. The UK has tried to clamp down on hiding property ownership through the use of a company by saying that if you own your property through a company, you now must put on record the actual owner of that company. And this is something called the Register of Overseas Entities database. And so if you have a company name, you now no longer can hide your ownership of a property in the United Kingdom. But back then, this didn't happen. But we still didn't have a company name or any full address of where Maxim Bakiev lived. So what I did next was there are various real estate agents, one called Zoopla in the UK. I'm not sure if it's available elsewhere, but Zoopla basically puts online information about house sales in the UK. But amount purchased and the date of the purchase. Doesn't give you any information on the owner, but we can deal with that in a second. So we knew roughly the time that Maxim Bakiev had arrived in the UK, it was 2010 after April, which is when the revolution was. And we have a rough idea, this place, Kingswood, which is just outside of London. And knowing that Maxim was a rich person, it was very likely that the property was going to be off over £1 million. So for a while, the team at Global Witness would be searching for properties using Zoopla and other real estate websites, looking for properties that fit that description. Bought after April 2010 in the area of KT20 in Kingswood for more than £1 million. And after that, once you have an address, you can then pay £3 to the UK Land Registry, and then you get a record of the owner, whether it be a company or a person. If you have an address, you pay £3, you get the owner of that property. That's how it works in the UK. For older addresses, if you want to find out who owned a particular property, say 10 years ago, you pay a little bit more money, £11, and you get the record on a particular date. But we were looking for the current owners because we wanted to find out where Maxim Bakiev lived. Still, though, using Zoopla, we had no hits. So I was almost at a loss, in the team at Global Witness. We couldn't find out where Maxim Bakiev lived. So I got on the phone. Sometimes we forget about the phones in 2026. And I called the land registry. And for some reason, because I think this house was a new building, it had just been built or rebuilt, the record for some reason wasn't in the land registry. And having spotted that, the woman at the land registry, having paid my £3, she gave me the address of Maxim Bakiev, the record of Spring House, Kingswood, KT20. And this is what you get when you pay your £3 in the United Kingdom. I think if you pay a further £3, you can get the thing on the right. You get a little map with a circle or square of the land that is owned by under the particular title. And on the left is the information regarding the property, and we can go through it. The title number at the top, that's just a reference for each house has a particular number in England. The address of the property. Finally, we get a full address. Woodland Way is the road. We get a full postcode there, KT26NU. We get the price, 3.5 million. We also get the owner. So Maxim Bakiev's name isn't on the property, but we do have a company name now, Limium Partners. Also interesting, the lender, none. Most people, even if you're rich, you buy a £3.5 million house, you usually have a mortgage. This person, no lender, so it means that they paid for this property in cash. So again, evidence that this person is quite rich. And then at the bottom there, the record will also tell you the date of the purchase. So you can see there where it says title absolute, number 1, 10/08/2010. So it was bought in August 2010. That was the date that Maxim Bakiev or Limium Partners Limited bought this particular property. It was kind of what we expected. He arrived in April. Took him a few months to find a property. We know this is the same Spring House because of the record from the UK court. But let's go back. We were talking about these companies a few moments ago. These companies that were involved in the scandal at the bank, and they were all registered at 1 Map Street, Belize. Well, look here. Where is Limium Partners registered? It's also registered at Map Street, Belize. Now you might say, oh, it just says Map Street there, not 1 Map Street. Well, go to Belize, get the company record. There's the company record from Belize. It confirms that the full address is 1 Map Street. And that corporate agent, the registered agent there, International Corporate Services Limited, is the same one who was involved with registering the companies on the right of the screen that were involved in the scandal at Asia Universal Bank. So what can we conclude? Well, it's not 100% proof that Maxim Bakiev was involved in the money laundering scandal at Asia Universal Bank. But it is quite a startling coincidence that of all the countries where you could register a company to buy a property in the United Kingdom, Maxim Bakiev chose Belize. And to be honest, having looked at property for the last 10 years, Belize is quite an unusual place to have a company that owns property in the UK. British Virgin Islands is very, very common for oligarchs in the UK. Belize not so, but not just the coincidence of the country being the same. Out of all of the company service providers, and I think there's about 80 in Belize, Maxim Bakiev has chosen the very same one Map Street, Belize, that was also involved in registering the companies at Asia Universal Bank that were involved in this alleged money laundering scandal. So it would seem to suggest that whoever Maxim has working for him is possibly the same person as who is registering these companies at Asia Universal Bank. It's not proof, but it's an interesting coincidence that we would say in our reports demands further investigation by the UK authorities. What happened since then? This was back in 2010. There's Spring House, by the way. Often when you have these houses, real estate agents will often put marketing materials online, and so you can see the luxurious house that the people you're writing about live in. Bakiev was granted asylum in the United Kingdom. He claimed that he was in danger for his life from the new Kyrgyz authorities. We don't know for sure, but because he's been here for over 10 years, he likely has British citizenship now. The US extradition attempt failed. They didn't manage to extradite him on this insider trading charge. He also faced a civil claim in the UK. A British businessman, accused him of trying to arrange his murder in the Kyrgyz Republic. This man was shot and unfortunately survived, but he alleged that Maxim was behind it. This civil case failed, with the judge finding that the evidence was not reliable. 6 million was recovered from the US authorities and sent back to the Kyrgyz Republic, but this was only out of an estimated 300 million that the Bakievs were alleged to have stolen. The bank, Asia Universal Bank, was nationalized. No investigation that we know of into the fact that this bank was very possibly a money laundering vehicle. Kyrgyz Republic had several presidents after Bakiev. There were one or two even democratic elections, but unfortunately in 2020, the president then, Jeenbekov, he was forced to step down, and since that time, the country has slid into a more authoritarian format, with journalism being cracked down upon under the current president, Japarov. So it shows you that the legacy of kleptocracy is one which is hard to escape. There are some rumors that the Bakievs are trying to find favor again in the Kyrgyz Republic. Those reports are unconfirmed. But again, slightly dispiriting end to the tale, in that after this investigation, there doesn't seem to have been anybody brought to justice for this, what looks like to be a money laundering scheme. So let's pause there and take some questions.
That was a very interesting story. Of course, we have many questions. I will start from the last part you started, where $6 million were recovered out of 300 million, while Maxim Bakiev was able to get the asylum, granted asylum in the UK. How can you justify this when a country can take him in and he is accused of money laundering and all these deeds?
It should have been a much bigger scandal than it actually was. Again, because I think the Kyrgyz Republic is not a very rich or well-known country in the UK. Had he been a top Russian minister, maybe he would have been granted asylum, but I think the publicity surrounding it would have been much greater. There was also a question about whether he should have even been allowed to claim asylum, because he first, after fleeing the Kyrgyz Republic, spent some time in Latvia and possibly also Germany. And if you know your kind of immigration law, if you claim asylum, you should really claim it in your first point of contact in the EU. But he was allowed to shop around and move to the United Kingdom, I think, claiming that his life was in danger. Now, in some ways, it's okay to give someone asylum if you really do believe their life is in danger. I'm not quite sure if the Kyrgyz authorities would really be, having the ability to send out kind of mercenaries to the United Kingdom. They have absolutely no history of that. Very few countries that do that. So I'm not quite sure about the claims of his life being in jeopardy. But even if we accept that, it's okay to give someone asylum if you try them for their alleged crimes. And this doesn't seem to have happened. And not only that, as you said, the money hasn't been returned. And this is something I think I'll end on later on in the presentation about how difficult it is to recoup monies once they have been stolen for a variety of reasons. And this is why I think we need new legislation to stop kleptocrats such as Maxim Bakiev and similar people similar to him.
Thank you, Tom. Regarding looking for properties, you mentioned the steps for through Zipla about acquiring through the land register of Zipla House, but the register wasn't there in the database. How can a journalist deal with these gaps and the missing of title deeds, or how can this registry itself, can it be considered as an indicator of something is missing or what?
I think this was a very unusual case that there was an actual record missing. I've never come across that before or since. I would say that the land registry website isn't easy to use, and sometimes you put in a postcode, for example, and the relevant records don't all come up. They are there. It's just the way of how you present the information. You can find the information, but it's not. The website is quite bad. I'm not sure if that's deliberate or just the UK government not being very modern in terms of how it does databases. But generally speaking, the database is good, and you pay your £3 and you can get the record of any property in the United Kingdom. And I think it is a good resource. It was just strange that one record was missing, but I tend to think it wasn't deliberate. It was just, as I say, because I think this was a new property and for some reason it hadn't been filed. I might be wrong, and there may be something more nefarious behind it, some secret reason, but I take what they told me as to be the truth.
Thank you, Tom. There's a big number of questions. I'm trying to get the questions related to this section. Khaled Abu Ruqayya asked about the company's registry. How can to what level can this registry be considered as credible, and that the work of that company is true, is correct and absolute?
I think there's maybe two parts to that question. If we look at the UK companies register, what has happened in the last few years in the UK is that we have started to put on the real owners, the beneficial owners, onto record. We're one of the first countries to do that. So you can no longer put a proxy on there. You can put a proxy on there, but you must also put the real owner. However, there are still issues with that in terms of reliability. When they first brought this system in, people were clearly abusing it because somebody put Adolf Hitler as one of the owners of the company, because there was no checks on this information. Only now, 2026, have they brought in passport checks. So when you register a company, you have to put in a passport. But even then, there's still a problem, because even when a person puts on their passport and you can see it matches up, how do you really know that that person is the owner? And that's a question that I think goes to the heart of proxy ownership, in that you can always have that. You can always have a person swear blind that they are the owner of the company, and actually there's a secret document or a handshake agreement that really they're acting as on behalf of somebody else. So the system is definitely better, and we think as journalists, as academics, that every country should have a beneficial ownership register. But there's still a long way to go in terms of just actually making sure that that information is true. The question, just very briefly, might be also referencing how could we trust the information from the Kyrgyz authorities about Asia Universal Bank? Well, it was just a list of companies, and it was our work that showed the links between them all. It would have been impossible for someone to fake that information, because they would have had to, prior to that, register all these companies and then give us a fake list. It was much more plausible that this was actually a bank, spreadsheet, and these were all companies that had that had accounts at the bank, and it was only through our work that we discovered that they were all linked and there was something suspicious going on.
Thank you, Tom. Last two questions. There's a question about the title, the address of Belize. All these companies that were fake countries, that were companies that were all registered in that one address. Sharing an address is a solid indicator that we need further investigations, that these are not real companies. What do you think?
I think if you've looked at shell companies and company registration, you know how often you find companies registered at one address. That in itself isn't necessarily a signifier of corruption. I have a company that I do some freelance work in, and for privacy reasons, I don't use my home address. I use one of these forwarding offices, and I think 10,000 companies are registered at this one address. I'm sure there are other not legitimate companies registered there, but my company is legitimate. But it is certainly something that you can point to and say, okay, it's a forwarding address. There's 10,000 companies registered there. What evidence is there of legitimate business activity? And often what you'll find is these companies, a lot of these companies in the Kyrgyz case, when we went to the UK companies register and got their accounts, they declared that they were dormant. Now, they can't be dormant if they have a bank account open. That's actually illegal under UK companies law. So they're lying to the UK authorities, but of course, the UK authorities don't know about them having an account in this bank in the Kyrgyz Republic. So you're building evidence as to what constitutes a red flag. And certainly having lots of companies registered a certain address when it's supposed to be independent companies each with an account at a bank, that is evidence that there's something suspicious going on.
Thank you very much. One other question. One of the owners, it was a dead man. It was a Russian man. How did you discover this? Was it through matching the registries with the deceased registry, or what was the methodology that you
Yeah.
followed to discover this thing?
We had the full name of this individual, and I think we just found a Russian news report. Russia in the early 2000s and the 2010s, and not obviously now, but back then, there was still, just to a certain extent, some good investigative journalism going on. And certainly when it was journalism perhaps not pertaining to the Kremlin, if it was just about organized crime, the research would be quite good. And there was one news report that said that there had been this case of a man whose passport had been used after his death, and his name matched exactly to the account that had been opened at the Kyrgyz bank. Now, often with these kind of things, the name matched exactly, so the middle name as well. We didn't take it any further. We perhaps could have spoken to the journalist in Russia and got some record, but we felt that the match was good enough to at least suggest that this was probably the same man as the person who had the account in Russia. And I think there was some indication that this man's name had been used several times in various bank accounts in some kind of different scandal in Russia. So that was an example where perhaps, again, you can't, it's not your own research, but you're relying on other people's research to make a point of in your own report. I think even if we hadn't got that link, it still would have been suspicious that there was this shell company in Belize and there was $700 million going through it, and there was no record of what this company was involved in.
Thank you, Tom. This reflects the importance of cross-border and collaboration. There's another batch of questions, but I think we will leave these till the end, and you can continue your presentation, Tom.
Thanks, Mohammed. This is a really interesting session. I'm glad we've got the time to go through these important topics. So in 2016, I think it was, I left Global Witness. I moved more into academia, but I was also doing some freelance work and working with another organization based in Austria called Freedom for Eurasia. Funding was primarily from the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States. Funding is a whole other issue we can perhaps talk about later. But Freedom for Eurasia's task, it works on human rights in Eurasia, and it also did reports on corruption. So I was responsible for those, and my idea was basically to do reports like I had been doing at Global Witness, but just framing them more perhaps on the region, and perhaps framing them more for the region as well. So producing information for people in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so on. And this was the second report that the third report that Freedom Eurasia produced, and it was about the former Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, Karim Masimov. Now, Karim Masimov, very famous figure in Kazakhstan, not perhaps so much outside of Kazakhstan, but he was basically the most important prime minister under the country's first president, President Nazarbayev, who ruled from 1991 to 2019. Masimov was alleged to have been a key part of Kazakhstan's kleptocracy. There was a transition of power. Nazarbayev stepped down in 2019. And it seemed that the transition of power was smooth. However, 3 years later, in 2022, there was, I think, some demonstrations about gas prices. And these spiraled out of control. And it was alleged that various people close to the former president had tried to depose the new president, Tokayev, and Masimov was blamed and he was jailed. But this gave us an opportunity to look at the career of Masimov and the fact that he was alleged to have been involved in many corrupt practices while he was prime minister, and then he was the head of the Security Council, which was called the KNB, which is the successor organization to the Soviet era KGB. So a very important figure in Kazakhstan. There's a little bit of his history. I've just gone through that. As I say, he was jailed for treason, perhaps making our job a little bit easier in that it's easier to talk about these issues in Kazakhstan. But most importantly, when we were doing a report on his corruption, we have to establish his salary, which we worked out would be about $100,000 a year. But also importantly, that under Kazakh law, you're not allowed to do any kind of commercial work. So he couldn't claim that, oh, I had businesses on the side. One issue with Maxim Bakiev, because he wasn't really a government official, he could say, well, I'm a businessman, I'm earning this money legitimately. Masimov couldn't say that. A major source for this report was the KazaWord email leak. Now, this was a data leak, not a famous one because it pertains only to Kazakhstan, of thousands of emails from various Kazakh politicians and officials. It contains whole threads, it contains attachments, photographs. The government of Kazakhstan understandably tried to prevent its reporting, but there was a legal case in the US that said that anyone could report about it under the First Amendment unless you'd been involved with its theft, and I guarantee you I wasn't. But still, we have many issues about when we have emails, how do we trust the information in the emails? How do we fact check our information? And I'm just going to go quickly through a few examples of what we found from this email archive. We found out that the former Prime Minister Masimov had spent £10,000 in a hotel in Paris. How did we check this information? Well, on the right is the Prime Minister's bill. On the left was another bill we'd found online, so we could compare it. Does it look similar? So far, so good. That does look it does look similar. So it looks like it is legitimate. What else can we do to check the information? We look at the date. Is there any information that suggests that Masimov was in Kazakhstan and not in Paris at the time? We actually found online somebody had put his diary online, one of his supporters actually. Well, this was valuable information in order to show that, yes, on the date that he was supposed to be in Paris, he did not have any meetings in Kazakhstan, and he didn't say he was on an official trip to Paris. So this looks very much like a family holiday. Indeed, one of the items we found on the bill was a Rubik's Cube, a child's toy. So it seemed very much that this was a family holiday. So £10,000 is €10,000, sorry, is a lot of money, but perhaps you would argue still within his ability to pay. But then we also found that he'd bought 3 letters written by Napoleon for €97,000. And what was interesting about the emails that accompanied these purchases was that the people arranging for the purchase of these letters were officials from the Kazakh embassy in Paris. So you imagine that, you know, they should be involved with state business, working on Kazakh-France relations. No, they seem to be involved with purchasing these rather nice letters for the prime minister. Now, from the email chain, it's not clear what money was used, but either way, there's going to be an issue. If this was Masimov's own money, then there's the question of where does he get €97,000 from, because his salary is only about his yearly salary is only that. And if it's not, if it's been bought for him, then there's a chance that it could be viewed as a bribe. So we were going through these emails in Russian, understanding the people involved and picking up on clues here and there. So, for example, let's talk about sending the letters back via diplomatic mail. So there's questions there about whether that's legal. Can you send personal artifacts back via diplomatic mail? And it mentioned a person called Orinbayev, and it just so happens that at the time, a man named Orinbayev was the deputy prime minister of Kazakhstan. So it seems like everyone's working on behalf of the big boss, who is Masimov. Now, of course, we don't have the full name of Orinbayev, so we have to check that information. Of course, it could be somebody else unrelated to the deputy prime minister Orinbayev. We wrote to Orinbayev to get his comment, and he didn't reply. And that is obviously an important part of the process, is going to the person and getting their comment. We found a medical bill, $313,000 this time. Doctors were flown from the United States to Kazakhstan to treat someone referred to as Mr. X. We don't know for sure if it was Masimov who was the patient, but it was sent, this letter on the left, to Talant Muratbayev, who was Masimov's personal assistant. So again, we can't say for sure, but we could raise the question that this would seem as if it is for Mr. Masimov or for somebody very senior, because it was sent to Masimov's assistant. Other things we found in the emails, it was sent to a worker at ArcelorMittal, which is a metals company in Kazakhstan. Again, that raises the question, why? Was this some kind of personal relationship between this one man at this company and Masimov? Or had Mittal somehow been involved in some way in the payment of this? And of course, if they had, then that raises other questions. In the end, we couldn't say who paid for this very high medical bill. But again, we can just raise questions and to say who is paying for this, and if it is a company or a person, is this is this legal under Kazakh law? And if it is legal, is it proper for somebody to be paying this huge amount of money for medical treatment? And a large part of the investigation into Masimov centered around this one figure who was alleged to be his proxy. The allegation against Masimov is that while he was prime minister, he had various links to companies, including telecoms companies, through this lady, Aygul Nurieva. And she was alleged to be a high-level proxy working for Masimov, and the money that she was earning was basically his money. I hadn't done much research on this one before, so I have a kind of a four-step process for what I do. I go to a media database. If you work for a university, you can have access to these databases. If not, here in the UK, you go to the British Library, or our biggest library, and they have databases, media databases, which you can use for free. Again, you're looking for colleagues who can provide you with this kind of help. What I do when I start an investigation is certainly if they're not a notable figure, obviously if you were researching somebody like Putin, it would be hard to do, but for somebody lower level, I like to read everything that's ever been written about the person in order to really understand what this person has been involved in. And from that, step two, I construct a timeline, not just a biography, but things that happen in this person's life. When are they registering companies? And often by constructing a timeline, you can start to see links. So perhaps there's a negative news article, and then a week later, a company gets closed, and you can start to link those two events together. Or maybe there's a marriage, and you see that very soon after a new company is formed, and you start to link that perhaps with the spouse. Having a timeline is very important in order to see the totality of what this person has done. And then, as we've seen in the previous investigations, you start to look at Companies House, which is the UK company registry. You start to put their names into other places and see what you can find. You start to build up charts of people who are involved with this person. And in addition to OSINT, in addition to open source information, you may be also asking people, we talked a little bit about how maybe it's hard to use that information if you can't corroborate it, but sometimes it will give you pointers that somebody from Kazakhstan might be able to say, oh, this person is using this bank or this company, and that'll give you a lead to go off and find some more open source information. So it's important to combine, I think, open source information with more traditional forms of, with human intelligence. So what did we find with Nurieva? We found a French property document. French property documents are called SCIs. Sometimes they're not all available online, but this one was. And you can see on the left, it gives us some important new information. It says Aygul Nurieva, but it also says Ihsan. It looks like she has a new name, suggests she's married, remarried. Also, we have two other people involved in this property company, and they're young, they're children. And if you know the Kazakh business landscape, you'll see the surname there, Abuova, because they're female. That is a famous, a notable businessman in Kazakhstan. So this brings the question of, well, are these her children? It looks like she's married someone called Ihsan. This is Abuov. What's the relationship between Aygul and Mr. Abuov? Why is she involved in this company that owns property in France? And as we see on the right, it's quite nice property. It's a huge villa with some lovely land in Cannes in the south of France. So we start to build a picture of Nuriev, that she's very rich. We find then going to Companies House in the UK, we put in her new name, Aygul Ihsan. We see that she's registered a company called TAN Capital, and there is an extract from Companies House on the left. You can do this search yourself. It's not secret, it's all open source. What do we see there? We see the nationality Cypriot, which is interesting. We know the scandal in the EU with the purchasing of passports from places such as Cyprus. If you purchase a passport, it allows you, because Cyprus is in the EU, and it allows you to settle in the UK. Once you settle in the UK, you can then vote, you can give to political parties. You can't do that if you're from Kazakhstan, or you can't do that as easily. So the fact that she's now got a Cypriot passport is interesting. But most interesting of as all, this new capital, this new company, TAN Capital, is registered at an address, and we have the address, 12 Hither Chantlers, in a small town called Tunbridge Wells. Well, like I've shown you before, what do we do when we have an address? We put it into the land registry, we pay our £3, and that confirms, I don't have the record on screen, but that confirmed that Aygul Ihsan is the owner of 12 Hither Chantlers in Tunbridge Wells. And you can go even further with that. One interesting thing that the UK allows for is rich people especially, they like to modify their house. They like to change it and build on it. That's the house, 12 Hither Chantlers on the left. 1.5 million, says the land registry record. But as soon as you change your house in any way, you need permission from the local council. All of these documents are available online. Now, they won't come up when you Google them, but if you go to the specific council website and put in the address, then those documents will be available to you. So this house was in a place called Tunbridge Wells. You go to the Tunbridge Wells Council website, you put in the address, and lo and behold, Miss Ihsan She did apply for planning permission to change her garage into an extension. And in this document, we're getting some biographical information. You can see in the yellow, make this property, it's viable for the clients, make this property viable for the client's family with 6 children. So now we have some more names perhaps we can search. We don't know the children's name yet, but we know they exist. We know Aygul Ihsan's age. We suppose that some of those children are going to be 18. Have they registered any companies? Building up this picture of more and more information about what this person has. And the last recommendation there, don't be afraid to knock on doors. I actually delivered a letter to this address. I wanted to make sure that Aygul Ihsan lived there, so we could say that she lived there. We also wanted to get her response to the accusations we were going to say in the Napoleon complex that she was a proxy for Mr. Masimov. And so I went round and I didn't say who I was. I just handed her the letter, but I confirmed that she lived there. So there's always a place in investigations for you doing it the old-fashioned way and to actually go around and see the property for yourself. Just before we get to that slide, the main allegation of her being a proxy for Masimov is difficult to prove because, as we said earlier on, the person can, and indeed Aygul Nurieva did sign a document when she was working for a telecoms company that said that she wasn't working for any politician, she wasn't working for Masimov. So in order to show that, we spoke to a lot of people who were involved with her, who all repeated the same thing, that they believed that she was a proxy for Masimov. And then on top of that, we showed her biography, showed her that she seemingly came out of nowhere. She was a bank manager, and all of a sudden, she's supposed to be the 5th richest woman in Kazakhstan. We show that she has all this property. Where is she getting the money from? We're raising questions in order to build up a picture which makes it more likely that she is a proxy for Masimov. And then ultimately, I think in the end, the BBC found a document that showed that at one particular moment in time, she was a shareholder with Masimov in a telecoms company. So that gives us a documentary evidence of they were in business together, again, raising likelihood so that when the Masimov steps out of that company structure, that she is still representing him despite what she is saying against that. Very briefly, I think it's time for some questions. We've not got too much time left. It's okay to find dead ends and to actually find out when information is incorrect. This was a news report in Kazakhstan. The headline there says Karim Masimov has $20 million worth of real estate in America. And what this person had done was to find Masimov's relatives in America and any address associated with those relatives, find the record, go onto the real estate websites of the America and tot up, calculate the amount of money that these houses cost, and came to the figure of 20 million. This to me wasn't rigorous enough. I was not sure about this information. So I started to look at the actual properties. And as I was saying before earlier, important to have lots of colleagues who can help you with things. Each state in America has its own system of company ownership, property ownership, and the amount of information you can get on those properties. Somebody from OCCRP helped me get the real owners of those addresses. And in the end, out of those 10 addresses or so, it was shown that Masimov's family only owned 3 of them, and they were relatively modest properties. They're there on the left, on the right, total 1.4 million, and kind of distant relatives of Masimov. Parents of brother-in-law's wife. That seems to be quite far removed, and again, not at a level we would expect if the money that Masimov was owning it's clear he wasn't really putting it into real estate in America. It was going elsewhere. So this was an example of something that would have been very good for the report, finding property in America, something that was found out actually not to be true. And we write that in the report. We say this isn't true, and we haven't found any corruption link with this property. Very finally, this report, as I said, was mainly about Kazakhstan. It was mainly for a Kazakh audience, but we did manage to get it into a UK national newspaper for the sole reason was that in that email leak that I mentioned at the start of this section, there was one photo never seen before of our famous former Prime Minister Tony Blair, pictured with Karim Masimov. Now, there's no link at all in the corruption between Masimov and Blair. Blair has done various consultancy works in Kazakhstan, which certainly raised questions over why he was doing that. But in terms of the corruption scheme, there's no link. But this is an example of just because of this one photo, the report was covered in a UK national newspaper and probably got more eyes onto the report than we would have hadn't we had this photo not existed. Very much fewer people would have seen the report. So that's kind of a way of getting attention to something when really it's not really about Tony Blair. It's really about corruption in Kazakhstan. But you'd rather be in the national newspaper because you want people to read your report and to learn about Kazakhstan. As for Nurieva, she's still living in the UK, and as we've seen, unfortunately, throughout these cases, no investigation into her, and nobody looking at this allegation that she's basically the proxy for this man who now is in jail in Kazakhstan. Let's take some questions.
شكرا توم. العمل على هذا اوكي العمل على هذا النوع من
Thank you so much for working on such investigations. It's very, very interesting. I mean, we're very much impressed. There is a large number of questions. I'll try to select the ones relevant to the topic, and there are questions that might we come back later on. In terms of the leaks, the investigation was based on a leak of an email and then decided on the US court decision in 2015 regarding the First Amendment. So how did you deal with authenticity? Have you double-checked every email separately, or did you rely on the general context of the leaks?
It was an interesting question in that this email leak is literally thousands and thousands of emails. So, and if you look at a lot of these emails, they were boring. They were not interesting. So it was clear that this leak, if it had just been one email, then you'd start to be a little bit suspicious and be like, okay, how come this person has just got one email? It very much did look like that someone had hacked into, it was mainly Gmail and Yahoo accounts of these officials. They were all using Gmail and downloaded thousands and thousands of messages. There are things you can do. You can write to those addresses. There's I think a program online. You can see if an address is active. Some of those addresses were still active. However, some of those addresses had been deactivated because the people knew that there had been this leak. But you go through that process that I described. You have a bill from a hotel. You make sure the bill is the same to other bills that you can look at. You write to the person, get their comments, see if they want to say that it's a forgery. If they say it's a forgery, then you report that information. The people we wrote to did not reply. If you look at the information contained in them, often it will have phone numbers, which you can then call. It will have addresses. Nothing about the email leak suggested to me that it was fake. And as I say, it would be very hard to fake 10, 20,000 emails. But that doesn't mean to suggest that the information in there is necessarily accurate. Of course, somebody could be saying, the Prime Minister is going to Paris to buy this, and it never happens. So that's why we went through extra checks in order to ensure that what we were saying was accurate.
Thanks, Tom. For the example about the hotel bill, Anwar asks, how could you extract the hotel bills, and the hotel bills are not OSINT?
I was actually thinking about this earlier. What counts as OSINT? And apparently, OSINT is anything that is online and publicly available. And as these emails had been put online, I think you can still download them now. I think they sometimes disappear and get put on a different server. Has a word leak. You could even search for it. If you have the know-how, you can basically download all this information, and therefore it's open source. It's a good question about the Panama Papers and all those records from banks. That's not OSINT, but it is now OSINT because it's been leaked and it's online. So even though that hotel bill wasn't OSINT, it is now OSINT. And not only that, even if you don't want to download or can't download the CasaWord website, if you go to the Napoleon Complex report, we re-uploaded the relevant documents, slightly redacted. Just we were trying to be even though you can get them unredacted in the original CasaWord leak, we put them up slightly redacted. You can click a link, and that relevant file will come up from the Freedom for Eurasia website, so you could see the hotel bill or whatever you want to see from that Napoleon Complex report.
Thanks, Tom. In the methodology you presented in your presentation regarding Masimov, you started with the media database, then the timeline, then you went to the companies, and then to the human in a linear way. But in reality, we as journalists, we deal with a chaotic situation. It doesn't go in that chronological order. Which of these four steps led you to the decisive decision? Was it from, did you start from the leak or the company house or the company register?
I think a lot of times you start with a lead. Somebody tells you something, and certainly in relation to Masimov, people for, I would say, 15 years have been saying that this woman, Aygul Nurieva, is Masimov's proxy. Okay, so they're saying it. How do we show it? As you say, the situation is chaotic, and there's information about her already, and she's also been involved in various other things that may or may not be related to Masimov. But because the target of the report was Masimov, who's a very important figure in Kazakhstan, prime minister, so the second most important political figure, it seemed key to focus on this allegation that this woman was his proxy. So that's why we focused on it. So in terms of the four steps, yes, it wasn't as if, we were researching it and then we came across this allegation. We were perhaps starting from this seed, this allegation that had been repeated many times, that this was a proxy of Masimov. But I think that is actually a good thing to do sometimes, because it gives you something to work towards. I remember occasionally at Global Witness, there was one report that we worked on. I wasn't working on it specifically. It was just to do a report about corruption in Nigeria. Okay, there's definitely corruption in Nigeria, but where do you start? And I think we went to the company's register at Nigeria, and it was looking around for something, and it was very difficult to find. Much easier if you have a specific allegation, and then you start to build up the data from there.
شكرا توم.
Thanks, Tom.
من بين القضايا الأربعة اللي عرضتها
Among the
رئيس
four
المجلس
cases,
الإسلامي أذربيجان
starting with the gas, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and the fourth case, which of these cases was the most difficult in terms of evidence collection? We're talking about OSINT. What was the story or the investigation that was difficult in terms of evidence collection, and which was the most serious security-wise or legal-wise on your team?
That's a good question. I think none of them posed difficulties from a data collection point of view, because we were, I think, very good at having created this method of tracing company ownership, following it through to its end, which in the gas case was showing that it was one office in Cyprus. I think where it gets more challenging, both, and this brings in the aspect of security and legality, libel, defamation, is when you get those accusations against Mr. Firtash of organized crime. That becomes harder to show because, okay, so you might have a report about the US ambassador saying that Mr. Firtash has links to organized crime, doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And also, very importantly, doesn't mean that you can't be sued for that statement. Repeating a defamatory comment is a defamatory comment, and it doesn't matter if you're just repeating what somebody else has said. You can also be sued for it. So that's why we were very, I think, careful with that, and we did try and get more information from Ukraine about those alleged links. In the end, I think the way we dealt with it was, we went on what was known, and for example, Mr. Firtash's lawyer at one point was also the lawyer for an organized crime figure in Russia. Now, you can't, just because one person is an organized crime figure doesn't mean that the second person is, but you can certainly say in your report, here is the lawyer, and by the way, he was also a lawyer for this famous organized crime figure, and just put that there. Sometimes you're putting something there so other people can investigate it. And I think other people, as I say, did go and investigate those allegations of organized crime. In terms of libel, we don't have that much time left. I was going to speak a little bit about libel. Involved in this work, if you're involved in this work, there's no such thing as no risk. I mean, that's my overarching finding. The UK system of libel and the protection of libel is crazy because it costs so much. It goes through the High Court, and if it goes to trial, sometimes things get settled before that. You're looking at £1 million to defend that case. So as soon as you put that price tag on something, that puts journalists and investigators in a very weak position, because we simply can't defeat that kind of money. We can't, we can't finance that. Now, there are various organizations that help you with pro bono and so on, but it's skewed, of course, in favor of the oligarchs, of the rich, the people who want to shut you down. But having said that, what a lot of lawyers will do in the UK involved in defamation was that they will highlight any risk and say, well, you can't say this. And my response to that is, well, that's what we want to say. And yes, it is risky, it is defamatory, but defamatory meaning it harms somebody's reputation. Yes, that is what we want to do. We don't want this person to have a reputation because we do think they have done something wrong. And if they sue us, we feel that our information is strong enough that they will back down. And if they don't, then we can deal with that. We can talk about how we can deal with that. But we're not going to be cowed by people sending threatening legal letters. And I think with all of these cases, maybe not the Napoleon complex where nobody replied, you know, some letters were written which were threatening defamation, but nobody followed through. We were not sued ever. So it shows you, to a certain extent at least, that our information was good.
شكرا توم. وهي درس من
Thanks,
السؤال
Tom.
الأخير من السؤال وإجابتك أنه نتحرى الدقة
So we need to be to
كثير
scrutinize.
صحفي
The
في
more
العالم
scrutinize the information,
التحري
the more
والتوثيق
healthy we will
والتحقيق
be. So we need to do
والمراجعة
fact checking. We need to
فاضل معنا
double
10
check.
دقائق
We only have 4 more
من
minutes
نصائح
to
عامة
go. Some
لنا
tips, maybe
كصحفيين عرب
some
كيف
advice to
يمكن
us as Arab
الألفاظ
reporters. How
المفتوحة
can we
في نشر
benefit from
الأحداث
OSINT
عبر
in
الحدود
producing cross-border or transboundary
في
investigations
المصادر
using
الشحيحة اللي في العالم العربي
the very scarce resources we
عبر
have in the Arab
الإنترنت أو عبر الإنترنت
world
الموثوقة في
through
هذا
maybe
الوقت.
some methodologies and techniques that you can advise?
Well, one of the findings I was going to talk about in relation to kleptocracy was that these are networks of people, not just the kleptocrats in Kazakhstan, but the enablers who are mainly in London. They're in the West. They're helping the kleptocrats, and they're forming these networks. What we can do as researchers and investigators is form good networks of people who know about certain things. So, for example, I'm very good with property in the UK. So if anybody listening here today has somebody they're looking at, maybe it's a politician in a country where you live and they have allegedly property in the UK, write to me and I will help you with that case. It's about building these networks of people who can help you with investigations. Yes, resources are finite, and I think they're getting more and more finite. Global Witness, in recent years, it's had to, I think, shrink its size a little bit, not as much funding for anti-corruption research. There was a boom of corruption reporting, I would say, about 10, 15 years ago. We're not seeing that now with President Trump in office. A lot of the funding for the National Endowment for Democracy has been cut. That's had an effect on Freedom for Eurasia, the organization that I work for. So it's just about finding these like-minded individuals who have access to certain documents, who can help you with certain ways of investigation. And I can certainly help you with anything you've heard today in relation to the UK.
Thank you, Tom. This was a very interesting webinar, very fruitful. I really learned a lot. 4 great models, different models. Every model or case had a different takeaways in terms of the methodology, the way, the pattern, the findings, the conclusions, and the findings. Thank you so much on behalf of Arij and the OSINT diploma. Thanks to the interpreters, Mary and Abdul Latif. And I hope everybody learned as I did. I hope to see you in the next seminars, everyone.